Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and in today's video, we're going to put together block number 5 for the Bliss Quilt Along. If you don't know what this is, it is a block of the month program that is included in sew sampler boxes that started shipping in April 2022 and will conclude in March 2023. We are on block number 5 of a 12 block quilt along and almost halfway there. If you want to do this at any point during this video, in the first comment down below, I'll have a link to a page on my website that has all the fabric requirements and links to all of the patterns. That way, in case you don't get the sew sampler box, you could still sew along with us. Block number 5 looks like it's going to be a pretty easy sew. This is what the block looks like when it's all put together. And as I've mentioned in my past videos, this isn't my pattern, so I can't give you the cutting instructions. So I have starched, cut, and labeled my fabric according to what the pattern says, and that's where we're going to pick up. So if you haven't done that, pause the video, go prep your fabric, and come right back. Step number 1 is going to have us take our fabric A squares and our fabric C rectangles, and we're going to use the stitch and flip method to snowball opposite corners. Let me show you how it's done. So these are our fabric C rectangles, and these are our fabric A squares. We're going to place our fabric A squares on opposite ends of our rectangle, and we're going to stitch starting from the outer bottom corner up towards the top, right on that diagonal. Now, when you're doing the stitch and flip method, you need some sort of a guide to make sure that your needle is going perfectly straight from corner to corner. You can do that the way that we've done it in the past, where you draw a line from one corner to the other corner and you stitch literally just a hair to the right of that line. Or if you have some diagonal seam tape or some other marking system, you can mark exactly where your needle is on your machine and just make sure that the corner is underneath the needle when you start stitching and the other corner is on that mark where your needle is. If you don't know what diagonal seam tape is, it's basically some washi tape that's designed to put on your machine. It's got 2 black lines on the outer side, and then exactly a 1/4 inch from either of those black lines right down the middle is a red line. When you put that on your machine, if you line up that red line exactly where your needle is, you can use those 3 marks to help measure your seams without marking. I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but I do have a mark on the bed of my machine that lines up exactly with where the needle is. And so I'm going to put my fabric in so that the corner is right where the needle is, and the other corner down here, which is off screen kind of, you can't really see, but this is lined up on my diagonal seam tape, which is down here, and also the mark that is on my machine. And then as this stitches, I'm just going to make sure that this corner stays right on that mark. When I come back over to my mat, I can push this over to make sure that that piece of fabric that I just sewed completes this 90-degree corner both perfectly from the top and the bottom. This is a bit of a time saver because now I don't have to mark the back side of each one of my fabrics. So I'm going to get sewing. As you sew on the second square on the other side of your rectangle, take a little bit of care to make sure that you are starting from the bottom corner and coming up to meet it in the middle, so that your unit kind of looks something like this once you've sewn it together. It can be really easy to forget that they should be coming up to the top and not parallel. Now that all of my squares are sewn onto my rectangles, I'm going to take a minute to test the flip to make sure that my fabric lines up properly. And I actually do have 2 pieces here where you can see My little triangle that I sewed on is not perfectly lined up. For this one here, you can see that the flip is shy of both sides of that fabric. So I know when I flip over my fabric, if it's shy from the front, that means I was to the left of that diagonal line. And if I'm too big from the front, then it means I was too far to the right of that diagonal line. This is a good time to just take a second, rip that seam, and stitch it again. That's much better. Now that we have all these sewn together, we want to take a minute to trim off the excess. So I'm just going to grab each unit that I sewed. I'm going to fold back this piece because I don't want to cut this off. And I'm going to line up a 1/4 inch mark on my ruler right on that seam that I just sewed. It doesn't have to be perfectly accurate. You just need to make sure that there's enough fabric to the right of where you sewed so that it doesn't unravel over time. This little piece you can discard if you want to, or you could take another stitch a 1/4 inch away from that cut edge, and then you'll have a pre-sewn half square triangle unit that you can press open, square up, and use in something else. That was a pretty easy step 1, but step 2 is even easier because we're just going to make a couple of rows. We're going to take 4 of our fabric E squares and 2 of our fabric D squares, and we're going to make a row of 3 with fabric E on the outer edges and fabric D right in the middle. We're going to take a seam on both of these areas and press them towards fabric E. I'm going to finger press the seams underneath that fabric E. And grab some heat and really convince it to lay nice and flat. It can be a little tedious to stop and press all the time, but I find I get so much better results if I really make sure my pieces are flat before I assemble them to the next piece. So that's step 2, and in step 3, we're going to do the same thing, only we're only going to make 1 unit, and in the middle, we're going to have our fabric F, and on the outer edges, we're going to have our fabric D. Spoiler alert, this is going to go together to make a 9 patch. For this, we're going to press it underneath our fabric F. That's going to help our seams nest really nicely when we put this 9 patch together. For step number 4, we're going to grab the 2 units that we made in step 2 and the 1 unit that we made in step 3, and we're going to lay them out to make a 9 patch unit. So you should have your fabric D kind of going in this cross type pattern. You should have your fabric E's in your outer corners and fabric F in the middle. Now, because I have taken the time to press underneath fabric F and fabric E, all of my seams are going in opposite directions. So that's going to allow them to nest really nicely. And what that means is when I hold up my 2 pieces of fabric to put together, the bulk of that seam is going to kiss. It's going to butt right up next to each other. I can take a moment to fold this back and test to make sure that my seam is nice and lined up. What I should see is fabric E and fabric F are literally just touching. So I should be creating like this little area where all 4 of my fabrics are pointing in at the same exact point. I don't bother to pin things like this. I just take it to my machine and I sew it. However, if you wanted to pin this or clip it, you absolutely could. What I like to do is line up and nest my first seam, get my needle in that seam bulk, and then line up my next seam, and then so on, so forth, etc. So I'll hold my seam with my finger down here and I'll start stitching. Once my needle gets into that seam, I'm going to stop and I'm going to line up the next seam I care about. I'm going to feel it with my finger to make sure that it's nice and nested. And I'm going to stitch until my needle gets into that seam, and then I'm just going to hold it at the end of that seam. And there is our first part of our 9 patch. We'll grab our other row and sew it onto the bottom. The instructions say for this 9 patch, we're going to press towards the top and bottom rows. So I'll press it with my hand from the back first, flip it over, give it a good pat with my hands to make sure all the seams are laying in the direction I want them to lay in, and then time for some heat. In our next step, we're going to build out our top and bottom rows for our block using 2 of the units that we built in step 1 and 4 squares of fabric B. We're going to lay out our step 1 units and put a fabric B square on one side and a fabric B square on the other side. Now, we are working with some directional fabric here. So if you care, and maybe you don't, but if you care to have all of your directional fabric going in a certain way, this is a great time to audition how your block will look when it's all laid out and play with those four corners before you sew everything together. I know this is going to be the top row and the bottom row. These are going to go in the four corners of my block. These will be the side units, and this is going to go in the middle. So I'm just going to turn my four corners so that I've kind of got like this type of action going on. That's what I'm going to put together. First, I'm going to sew my top row and bottom row, and I'm going to press the seams out towards these fabric Bs. Because I have directional fabric and I oriented them in a certain way, I do want to make sure that I don't change the orientation of how these fabrics are to one another. So I'm going to pick up my row here. I'm going to lift my square, flip it over right sides together. I know I'm going to sew on this side. I'm going to do the same thing down here, and I will very carefully pick up these two pieces, go to the sewing machine, and take my seam. Finger press this over, and then I'm going to come back and pick up this piece, lay it right side together on top of my row, take my stitch here and here. I'll be honest, it's a little bit of an extra step to take the piece that I just sewed back to my design board or my mat, but I find when I do that, that I can actually lay my fabrics on there the way they're supposed to go, and that way when I turn one piece, I'm guaranteed that I'm turning both of them. And then I less frequently make mistakes. I still make mistakes, but this helps keep me organized. Now that we have our top and bottom rows sewn together, let's sew our middle row together. We've got everything laid out in the way it goes. So I just want to point out that these green fabrics should be oriented so it looks kind of a little bit like a square in a square. We've got this diamond shape happening around our 9-patch square. As long as that's correct, then I'm going to take my side unit, lay it right side together on either side of the 9-patch. I'm going to take my seam here and here, and I will press in towards the middle, which is going to allow all of these seams to nest really nicely when I put the block together. No seams to match up here. You just have to make sure your raw edges are nice and lined up. Once that middle row is assembled, it's just time to put on our top and bottom rows, and then our block is done. We're going to press our block out towards the top and bottom rows. So I'm going to finger press that into position first, then I'll sew my next row, and I'll give the block a good final pressing. Once the block is all sewn together, we're going to press it out towards the top and bottom rows. So I'm going to push everything out with my hands. Then I'm going to come in with some heat. And then I do like to use a good bit of best press once my block is all sewn together. These are going to be collecting in the box for a while. I feel like that best press helps give my fabric a little bit of body, and it also helps reduce fraying just a little bit, so it holds up a little bit better in my opinion. Plus, I just really like the way fabric feels when it's been starched. So this is block number 5 for the Bliss quilt along, and when it is all done, it should square up to 10.5 inches. Now, I'm going to point out something here that I normally wouldn't do, but I'm doing this in the interest of maybe helping you feel a little bit better about your sewing journey. My block is not perfect, and quite oftentimes I have mistakes or oopses in a lot of the projects that I make, but I don't feel like you always see those imperfections when I'm creating videos or posting social media content. So I'm going to highlight right here, these points do not go together absolutely perfectly, but you'll notice when you just kind of take a step back and look at the block overall, you still get what I was trying to do. When this quilt is all pieced together, quilted, and washed a couple of times, nobody's going to notice this one little intersection. And if they do, they're not worthy of receiving this quilt. That's just my opinion. All I'm trying to say is most of us make mistakes in our projects. I am sure there are a few quilters out there who only produce absolutely perfect items, but that's not me, and that's okay. Enjoy the journey of creating rather than stressing about the perfection. Thank you so much for sewing block number 5 for the Bliss quilt along with me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and smash that little ring bell off to the right of it, and come on back next month when we sew together block number 6. I'll see you guys all real soon. Bye!